Good afternoon and welcome to the first Backstage of this year. Compared to the previous years, this is the third season and we had to apply a few changes, so until it will not be possible to fill this room with people, our Backstage will be streamed live. The updates will arrive on our website, alfaromeo.com, and on our social media channels, as well as the news. But the spirit of the Backstage remains the same, and as well as the elements that has always guided it since the beginning. We expose objects that usually are not showcased, and we tell their story through the main players of those epics. But we also draw inspiration from our archives and share the results so that every time we share with you what we find. In 2021, the 12 Backstage meetings will be led by the many anniversaries that this year we celebrate, and we start exactly from one of the most important, the Targa Florio from 1971 that Alfa Romeo was winning, won with 33 liters, and for the first time brought for the Campionato Mondiale World Championship Marche brands that car. But before, let's start feel the environment of Targa Florio with the documentary of that age. Please, no one can cross the road tomorrow because there will be a race. Please keep your dogs and children at home. There is risk of dying. Today, on these rough and suggestive places with agave and prickly pears set in time, there is a race of cars arrived from a planet of technology and speed. On these steep, hilly roads, the 55th Targa Florio takes place, the most ancient, famous and difficult race in Europe. What we just saw is not a documentary of Rai, but it's a starting point of the documentary that Alfa Romeo, with the title of Alfa Romeo Wins, produces to celebrate the 1971 Targa Florio, which is the topic of this Backstage. And our habit, the need of telling the atmosphere of that period and that race is not a detail. Targa Florio became one of the most important races in the world, and maybe it was this since the beginnings. It was made of development of cars, speed, great enterprises, but it was unique for the place where it took place and for the way the pilots and the public lived those days. Here we have Targa Florio from 1971 that Alfa Romeo won with 33 3 liters, and Vaccarella Hezemans. Targa Florio was exactly a plate, which in Italian is a targa. And that race continues a tradition. For Alfa Romeo there will be 10 victories in Sicily that started with one of the most important races in the history of Alfa, Targa Florio of 1923, where Ugo Sivocci on the RL won for the first time, and for the first time with a 4-clover leaf on the hood. And that 4-clover leaf will become a lucky charm, but also the symbol of all the racing cars of Alfa Romeo, and starting from the 60s it identified the top of the Alfa Romeo cars also. But Targa Florio was also a real race that was exhausting. There were 11 laps of a track on the roads, and the roads were not well maintained, and each lap was 73 kilometers. So the pilots were very tired, and it was a race that today would be driven as a rally with a GPS and navigator, but the pilot had to memorize an incredible number of curves in 73 kilometers. Curves, holes, and unknown elements, because you crossed small towns. If you think about 1923 or in the 30s, where Nuvolari, Barzi won the Targa Florio, you think about the hidden traps. But even worse, think that in the 70s, in 1971, that race was run with 300 kilometers per hour cars, like the 33 liters that in 1971 won that race. But that race was a race of cars, but especially a race of men and pilots. That race was won by Nino Vaccarella, the flying president, the Presevolante. He was the king of the Targa Florio, both for the wins that he had and also how he won, but also for the passion of the audience that was crazy for that Sicilian pilot winning in Sicily in front of international competitors and supporters. Next to him, there was another pilot that at the time was racing for Alfa Romeo with the GTAM, Hezemans, Toine Hezemans, which was a Dutchman that we found today driving his car. It's not the 33 liters, but he will tell us something, of course by phone, concerning what he felt in that race. So thank you, Toine Hezemans, for being here. So the first question is linked to the 4 clover leaf. So luck was important. What was the role after 1923, the clover leaf designed on the 33? Yes, good afternoon. Actually, we were lucky enough because we didn't have problems, because the competitors, the Porsche, went off-road, broke something, but we were very lucky and we won without problems, I would say. So it was a very difficult race, but you had a teammate which was the favorite, and I also showed to be the best ever at the Targa Florio, Vaccarella. How was to drive next to Vaccarella? Vaccarella was a phenomenon for the Targa Florio. He knew the track better than us. He raced many races, and then he was living in Sicily, so it's logic that he knew the track very well. After the first lap, he had already 1 minute of advantage. He was ahead of the others, so it was easy for us to win. 73 kilometers for 11 times. Everything went smooth, or there were hidden traps or something that happened. Well, actually the most impressive thing to me was during the tests, and our car was stuck in the middle of the road because we had a flat tire, and Carlo Chicchi, the sportive director, asked me to go with a helicopter of the Carabinieri armed forces to look for Vaccarella, and that is something which is impossible today. But at that time, he asked to the Carabinieri armed forces to transport me with a helicopter and a tire to go and look for Vaccarella. And so I gave the new tire to Vaccarella. He could change the tire and he could continue his race. It is something incredible that today is not allowed, of course. So everything was possible at the time. Winning the Targa Florio with an Alfa Romeo next to Vaccarella was an incredible success of audience, but it was also a success for Alfa Romeo. Alfa Romeo, well, we are used to consider it a big family. Was it true? Did you feel this sense of belonging in the team? To me, the team of Alfa Romeo was very fun. It was the best of my career, because for each race where we went, Buenos Aires, United States, there was always Italian cooking. We ate Italian food, people were happy and fun and kind, and it was really really a fantastic period for Alfa Romeo and for me. Thank you, Toine Hezemans, for this witnessing, these memories, and I hope that we can meet in real life here in Museo. We have a GTAM which just waits to be photographed with the pilot that won the most with that car. But the Targa Florio was not only a race with a good atmosphere, an incredible man, it was also a technical race where there were slow parts, very fast parts, there were hidden traps, as we already said, and every element had its weight. So, narrating the Targa Florio of the time, we have a commentator which is exceptional. Maybe you have already recognized his voice in the few seconds at the beginning of this backstage, but the commentary of that documentary that the Alfa Romeo launched and produced in 1971 was not of a journalist, of a technician, but was of its protagonist, Nino Vaccarella, narrating not only what was Targa Florio, but maybe almost curve after curve what happened during that race which led him to the victory. Targa Florio is the meeting of spring for Sicily, for everyone, for the young people of Palermo, Catania. It is a feast, a celebration, just like the patron saints of the small towns, and just like the local celebrations. It is lived with passion, and the Sicilian men get out of their solitudes and live happily for one day. Alfa Romeo has already won the Targa 8 times and is present with 3 cars, the 33 liters cars. Born in 1967 and 2000, they became 3000 in 1969. They already won in 1971 a world race, the 1000 kilometers of Brands Hatch in England. The prototypes are real high-speed labs, and the track of the Targa looks to put to the test the suspensions, the brakes, the tires, the brakes, everything, every part of the car. The team of the pilots is also international, but 2 Italians, the Adamic is a veteran of Alfa, and me are the team leaders. I'm Nino Vaccarella, I'm 37. It is the 11th time that I take part in the Targa Florio. The first time I won it was in 1965 with Ferrari 3003 with Lorenzo Bandini. It was one of the most important and unforgettable victories of my career. Last year, I raced again with Ferrari 312. I arrived 3rd. The official tests gave me the victory, so I hope that today I can also make again another victory with Alfa Romeo and to beat the Porsche that I've been winning for the last 5 years. At the paddocks, the technical directors and designers are present for Alfa Romeo, engineer Satta and Kitty. The last one is director of Autovelta for Porsche, Piek, the nephew of the founder of the brand and technical director of the racing department. It is a high-end challenge. This is the longest day. So I'm the first with number 5. I am with Hezemans. 33 of the Adamic follows me. These are the first images of the track. At the 21st kilometers, there is the first camera. So we are reaching the highest point of the circuit, 600 meters above sea level. Alfa 33 Privates of Patracodones, and the 3rd of the Porsche, number 7 of Siffen, is here. You can see it. In a few kilometers at Caltavoturo, Fredman will go off-road. There will be a fire in the car, but without consequences for the pilot. You see, at 28 kilometers, this is the second spot. You go through Caltavoturo at 635 meters, where the first, me, the Adamic, Larousse and Bonnier, who overpassed Cadaris. The first of the 3 Porsches, the Renman one, had an accident, and one of our 33, number 6 of Sunman, had to retire at 10 kilometers after the start because the hub of the wheel broke. We arrived at the 48th kilometer. We enter in Colle Santo, a little town which is distinguished by the passion of their inhabitants for me. In 1967, at the time I was with Serfiotti, I lost the Targa because I went against a pavement. This is number 4 by Rodriguez. This year, he will go against the pavement. From Colesano, you go down towards the sea. You see, this is Bonfornel, the only stretch of the circuit where cars can speed at the maximum. Again, we can have some lead because we arrive at 300 kilometers and Porsche only 260 kilometers. After first lap, chronometers record an advantage of 4 kilometers for the red car, but the second lap, the better conditions of the road allow me to go faster. At the second lap, 34 minutes and 20 seconds, so I overpass the Porsche, which is slower by 30 seconds. The Adamic is very regular in his lap. My friend Andrea wants to place again the good results of the previous places. The French pilot is working hard, but Andrea doesn't modify his pace, knowing, as you see these images, that the Porsche is lighter, but the Alfa Romeo is stronger, more powerful. So we see number 4 by Rodriguez, which is not in the race anymore because he went against the pavement. The second lap is over. Autovelta, the sports director, calls Mr. Severi, that is calculating the timing. They will inform me that I have the best timing. We tested on the 70 kilometers of the track 4 months before with a normal velocity and normal car to know every bend of the track. And then during the tests with a real car to remember every part and test every part where I could speed and overcome all the difficulties due to the differences in the asphalt and tarmac. This is one of the most difficult circuits and tracks, in total 722 kilometers for 11 laps. The third lap is concluded for Alfa. It is the pit stop moment and change of pilots. Toine Hezemans replaces me. He is a Dutchman. The Adamic is arriving. Another the Dutch pilot arrives at this place. It's a young pilot that usually races for Porsche, but this year races for Alfa Romeo. In the fifth lap, Elford continues very well, but both Hezemans and Van Lendep respond well, and so they keep racing hard. Alfa have to play their cards yet, and this could overturn the situation. 6 hours of race, 6 hours of sun, heat, screams, enthusiasm of engines that is exhilarating and inebriating. The great celebration continues. Tomorrow, each one of these spectators will be a narrator, just like those who were present in Palermo in the past. The race of Alfa continues regularly. I prepare to replace Hezemans. During his laps, I slept a little bit in order to recover my energy, but the tension that you build up during such a race makes you particularly nervous. Everything will pass. Hezemans arrives after the 6th lap. the mechanics, with Mr. Marelli and Makiti, tried to be as quick as possible, quicker than the German ones, without reducing the safety. Also, the tires are changed. Tires are used very quickly on such a track. Larousse continues, and he didn't change the tires, but you see a flat tire. For example, look at here, but again, he will have a second flat tire later, and he will have to abandon the race. Alfa Romeo goes at first and second place, a victory which was won since the test with the quickest laps. So it was deservedly won for the incredible resistance and resilience. Alfa Romeo with Andrea De Adamic, Toine Hezemans, and me conquered the winning places for the 9th time in the most legendary race in the world. It is a great witnessing, and even though 50 years have passed, it is still as vivid as yesterday and keeps alive the dangers and the feelings of that race. That race was a meeting that Alfa Romeo wanted and needed to win. Years passed since the last victory. Since 1950 they didn't win, and the project of the 33, which was born in 1967, needed a great international victory. So Alfa, in that edition of 1971, arrives with an incredible team made of 3 cars of 33 liters and 430 horses, which were identical. From the technical charts, we discovered that was only a slight change in the springs, in the calibration of the springs. For the rest, the 3 teams, Vaccarella, Hezemans, De Adamic, Van Lennep, and Kinkunen Sommenen, were racing with identical cars. But there was a 4th car, the first prototype of 33 TT3, which for the first time went on the track, actually on the road, which was driven by the historical test pilot Teodoro Zeccoli of Alfa Romeo together with Carlo Facetti. That car didn't start the race, it also participated in tests, but the Kinkunen Stommenen was unlucky. They had to retire because they broke a hub at the first lap. The other 2 will battle and fight till the last kilometers. And we have the honor today of having Andrea De Adamic connected here, telling us something more about that race and about that atmosphere. So thank you, Andrea, for being here with us. I'm very pleased, and I would like to start this interview with a question. How was to race the Targa Florio in 1971? Well, Targa Florio in 1971, but actually in that entire period, was one of the most unusual and fantastic, impossible races. If you look at it with today's eyes, of the Sport Prototypes World Championship. I took part for the first time in 1964. I was 22, with a Ferrari 250 Le Mans, which Bettoia gave me. He was an important pilot, but he was an amateur. And I did a good job. The track was 63 kilometers, but I said before it was incredible, impossible, inconceivable with today's mindset, but for the entire world, the Targa Florio represented a formidable element in terms of curriculum, sports curriculum, because the pilots, it gave great prestige to the pilots. There were no specialized pilots like Jackie Stewart or Jimmy Clark, which were in my times specialized, so they were not participating because it was difficult, because at that time Nino Vaccarella was the king, but there were many others. I was one of them, and since we raced it several times and we finished the 10 or 11 laps of the track, well, so we gathered incredible experience on the field, which was impossible for those who arrived for the first time. So it was dangerous, it was difficult in terms of assistance and safety, so many of the professional big names preferred not to race. So a race is an atmosphere that cannot be repeated, but there are legends. The Targa Florio is said to have donkeys crossing the road and the race, but the cars speeded at 300 kilometers per hour. Well, donkeys were not a legend, were a reality, but it was not during the race. It was during the test that that was possible, because the road was not closed to the traffic. It was open to the donkeys. I'm talking about the free tests, not the official tests. But we had so many tests. We shortcut a part of the circuit that I knew very well, the Colesano, and we used at one point the highway to go back towards Cefalù. So that part was tranquil apart from the traffic, but there were 3,000 prototypes with engines similar to the Formula One. So the donkey was represented by the shepherd, by the farmer, that used donkeys as means of transportation, as a tractor, because they transported wood or hay for the animals. And with the donkey, he went to work where maybe he had sheep or cows or whatever. So every now and then you risk to find him on your trajectory. And I remember one time that there was one of these donkey drivers that went to Mr. Pitti saying, I lost the hay, I got scared, I was transporting something, I need to be refunded. And I remember that with a few thousands of liras, at the time there was liras, the thing was set. So that shepherd also became one of our supporters. But the donkey was a reality. Dangerous on one side because, you know, the prototypes were very low. So the risk, well, I never hit a donkey, luckily, but you risk to go with the head of the car below the belly of the donkey, but your head would have hit the donkey. So behind every legend there's a basis of reality. In this case, it's incredible. Are there other memories of that race? Even the relationship with Vaccarella, who was a competitor, was also a great pilot, where we are talking about 1971. We were lucky to have Vaccarella in our team. Vaccarella was a certainty, but we're talking about the race already here. But what was not repeatable as an atmosphere, especially for the foreign pilots, were the tests and the period that anticipated the race. We had a base at the top where you could see the entire valley, so you were sure to test the track, looking at the others, looking if the others were arriving. But we closed the road, so there were a couple of mechanics with the car, and we blocked the road to be able to cut the curves so no one could come there. But if there was a donkey, for example, as you said, in that stretch, you would have found him in your trajectory. But there was a fashion. We were at Cerda in a small hotel, but there was also a garage which became the base in the entire pre-race period. Then in Cerda there was also the starting point and arrival point of the race, and the mayor of Cerda, and in that time there was artichokes which were fresh. So Friday night, before the official tests, he organized a dinner in his estate with all the artichokes braised in 200 square meters. There were artichokes with local oil. So these are things not linked to the race, but if you think about this with today's mindset, this represents a history that if you didn't live it, is incredible, and you have to tell it to your nephews. When you tell this to the modern pilots of go-kart, Formula 1, Formula 2, the prototypes have lost that appeal of those times, because prototypes, the 1,000 kilometers Targa Florio, were more important than the Grand Prix almost in the image of the public, of supporters, but especially Italian and foreign supporters and fans, not only in Sicily but in general. So these narrations represent opportunities of history, and I repeat, if you didn't live it, it's impossible to feel. We maybe ate 3 or 4 kilos of these artichokes with oil. It was not artichokes that ripened after being cropped, but there were great artichokes which were very soft and edible, because there was a great pulp. I'm sorry, this is off topic maybe, but it was a great memory for me. On the other side, you had an aspect, so you talk about 300 kilometers per hour. So there were 33 kilometers, there was a mixed part with 3, 4, there were 5 shifts, not 6 shifts at the time. But you have 4 shifts for the entire mixed track, and the average was 60 kilometers there. At Bonfornello, there were 8 kilometers of stretch along the sea, and you reached with the 5th gear 290, 300 kilometers per hour. So I remember that we were very noisy. So the entire, for 60 and some kilometers, there was a bam, bam, bam with 4 gears. Then when you arrived at this stretch, you put the 5th gear and the noise changed. At the end of the stretch, there was an incredible speed. So there was a contrast. And this stretch increased that average of kilometers that was around 60 kilometers per hour if there were not Bonfornello stretch. So the teammate, is always the first competitor. How was it? Was it a hard fight in 1971? Well, at those times, we're talking about 1971, I repeat, the difference was that Vaccarella at the time was not so quick as us in the other traces. For example, Urboni, but it was 23 kilometers. 23 against 73 is different, and with a minimum of safety measures. In Targa Florio, I remember that when Regazzoni went off-road in the test, we had to go with 2 mechanics. There was me and the Carabinieri with the helicopter. So the 2 mechanics were there because the risk at those time was that the car would go down and everyone would steal everything from the car, because the local audience wanted to have a piece of the car. And once with Vaccarella and my team, another car was left because the gear was broken. The car was left by the pilot, who went back hitchhiking. So when we arrived there, there was the no longer the engine, the 12 cylinders engine, no longer there. It was incredible. Vaccarella looked for it, and the next day we found it exactly in the place where it had to be. So the environment was an environment where Vaccarella was a leader, both during the race but also in the Sicilian environment of that time. It was 1971, there was a great battle and fight. The strength of Vaccarello at the Targa Florio was that we knew the track, but we didn't have those certainties. For example, that bend, that curve, you have to brake, you have to change the gear. So it's just like the rallies, but we didn't have notes. Well, in the rally, you have a co-pilot who tells you everything. So you were not 100% sure of how to tackle the track. So you tended to slow down a little bit. In doubt, you would not remember well. When you had to brake, probably you shifted gears and it was not necessary, but Vaccarella was 100% sure. He knew that every bend and curve had to be tackled in a specific way, without doubt. So after 73 kilometers, this was an incredible advantage for the timing. But in 1971, I remember that his teammate was Hezemans, and I had Van Lennep. So they were both Dutch, but Van Lennep was quicker than Hezemans. Vaccarella was quick, but a little quicker than me. I have all the timings in my personal archive. I believe it was 10 laps at the time, not 11, but I'm not sure at the moment. But when Hezemans and Van Lennep came up, well, Van Lennep was better than Hezemans, so every 30 seconds there was a go. So for us, it would have been sufficient to arrive behind Vaccarella, Hezemans, with 29 seconds, and we would have won the Targa Florio, not for my merit, but for Van Lennep. But having a Vaccarella as a winner of the Targa Florio was a bigger headline than Andrea De Adamic and Van Lennep victory. So the directors told us to stay like this, and when we had to change a pilot, I told Van Lennep, "You're here only for this road. Don't you have to speed up." I tried to say things that were not true, but he was very respectful. But for me, it was more important to win the Targa Florio, because Vaccarella already won the Targa Florio. Thank you for these witnessings, but I have more questions for you later on. The car that we see here is a 33 liters, similar to the one that won the Targa Florio, not identical. The Targa Florio one had a short tail. This one has a long tail, and it was developed to race the 24-hour of Le Mans, a difficult and different race. And with a long tail, you went from 310 to 330 kilometers per hour. It is the third year of our Backstage appointment, and it is something made by passionate people for passionate fans. There are important elements. One is the participation of the protagonists. Today with Andrea De Adamic and Hezemans, we had two incredible witnesses, apart from the Nino Vaccarella one, who was the commentator of the Targa Florio from 1971. The other pillar is the archival research. Backstage also means go looking at the archive of Alfa Romeo, the documents, and telling you details that are not known of those stories. Targa Florio was one of the many races of the World Brand Championships in 1971. There are important documents. We'll talk about the Backstage. Here there are technical charts signed by Carlo Chitti, which were sent to Alfa Romeo to the attention of Dr. Luraghi, Di Nola and Bardini. It was just like presenting the activities in order for them to have the support of Alfa Romeo in the sports activity. So there were the timings, the pilots, the comments on the race, a chronicle, sometimes also notes of Carlo Chitti for the pilots when they did something wrong. Not in this case. We know that 9:15 of them in the morning, the weather was good, the asphalt was discreet, slightly worse than last year. 18 degrees was the temperature. And then the average of Vaccarella Hezemans is 126 and 180 kilometers per hour on the 73 kilometers of race. And if we remember what Andrea Adamowicz said before, it is even more incredible. If 60 kilometers was the average, there are all the timings charts, but we'll see with time what is the truth. But if we continue to dig in the archives, we see the consequences of those victories and those tracks. Here, the award ceremony of 1971 is told. It was an award ceremony that every year was held to celebrate all the pilots who won with Alfa Romeo, officially or privately. So these pilots received from Alfa Romeo not a simple trophy of our plate, but a real work of art commissioned every time to an artist of the time, a world artist. And in one of our backstage of last year, we dedicated exactly to these sculptures the story. But there's everything here, the invitations, the description of the trophies, the setup of the tables, even a menu with trout fillet, pasta, roast and wine list. So you go back to that evening, to that incredible award when Luraghi made his speech, which was different every year, and every year was used to compliment the pilots, to also remember those who died, but to tell how important were tracks for races for Alfa Romeo. Just a sentence of Luraghi. As a statistics, in advertisement and interviews this year, we declared that Alfa Romeo obtained more than 500 victories, out of which 50 absolute victories, but in reality, I must say that counting them one by one, in 1971 victories were 560, 55 of them absolute victories. And then he adds that many of these victories obtained by private pilots all around the world. Maybe in this speech and in that great leaflet published by Alfa were not listed. Alfa Vince was the title that linked all the victories of the races for Alfa. So it was the intro also of the documentary that we saw before, and this was used to sell automobiles, to make Alfa bigger, but also to enthuse the public. In another point of the archive, in another universe if we want, we have all the letters that arrived at Alfa Romeo Autodelta. And there are so many letters of young kids or children who wrote things like, I'm a young kid, my name is Sergio, I live in Trani, near Bari, etc. I'm a fan, I would like to race a few Formula 3 races. I don't know who to ask and what to do to participate, so I ask you some explanation. I would like to know at what age I can start racing. Other important documents are the images that, together with the videos, help us relive those moments, the starting point, the different steps of the track of the race, the arrival part, the victory. And here we see an extraordinary image, the award ceremony, not of the race, but the Nino Giunti trophy, which was given to Nino Vaccarella for the fastest lap. And in January 1971 in Buenos Aires, on a Ferrari, Ignazio Giunti dies, and for Alfa Romeo, he was one of the main pilots, one of the most loved by the public in that time. And now I would like to ask to his teammate and friend Andrea De Adamic to remind us who was Ignazio Giunti. Well, first of all, I was a friend of Giunti for a specific reason, apart from the races and the tracks. Well, because friendship can also become a contrast, competition, so friendship is left aside. So you are correct always, but it's not because you have a friend that you are softer. He had a fiancée, Mara. She was a former Milanese model, so he came often to Milan to see her. At that time, I was living in Milan. Today, I am in Varano de Melegari, the track at the Centro Guida Sicura Scuderia de Adamic, which on request by Marchionne, the name was changed. He wanted my name because I was a Ferrari pilot, and Scuderia, that is racing team, because he wanted to give a sportive appeal. But apart from these historical aspects, together with Giunti, there was some rivalry on the track. Giunti was called Reuccio di Vallelunga, so the king of Vallelunga. On one side, he was an exquisite person. He was a great pilot when he raced at Spa for the first time with Ferrari. That was the only track in the world that I feared a little bit, because with the 3000 there was a bend which was very difficult. So for Porsche 917 with 5000 arrived at 275 average, and with the 3000 we arrived at 245. So you understand that having a road track with cars and U-turns and bends, well, it was hard for me. I arrived at second place after Ciffer and before Rodriguez Porsches. Of course, Rodriguez had a few technical problems, otherwise it was impossible, unless there was a wet asphalt, because in the Brandsatch 1000 kilometers and the 6 hours of Wattensel, 2 races of the World Championship in 1971, it was a wet, and in Brandsatch with Pescarolo and in Watkins Glen with Ronnie Peterson, these were 2 pilots that arrived in Alphabet because they were as tall as me, and we didn't need to change the seat. So you didn't lose time, but the risk was that a seat change would not go very well inside, and so you lost seconds during the filling up, which lasted a few seconds. So there was a history linked to these Alfa Romeo aspects. So in 1971, I arrived second, third, and fifth at the Targa Florio. So my resume is good. Giunti, I don't remember. His performances at the Targa Florio, I don't remember, but Giunti, I repeat, personally was an exquisite person, was a quick pilot, and above all, he was an accident at the 1000 kilometers of Buenos Aires, where I arrived third with Alfa Romeo. So there were Beltoise who pushed the car, but at the time a pilot that finished fuel close to the paddocks, everyone was pushing the car at its limits. I remember the image of Mansell in Monza. He finished the fuel close to the paddocks, and we pushed his car. He fainted then while pushing a car. These moments were sports moments that, apart from the regulation that banned to push the car, but Beltoise wanted to go to the paddocks. There was also I defended Beltoise at the time. It was a tragedy, but I don't know if you want these details, but Giunti had the only 312, the official one. He was heading the race and he reached his Ferrari teammate who was racing with the 512, which was the equivalent of the 917, but not as competitive. And that was a car which was practically an official car because it was from the Filippinetti, American racing team. Filippinetti was just the importer, so it was practically an official car that Ferrari supported, not to have the entire team linked to its mechanics, etc. So to be more lean. So when Parsi was doubled, and at that time for Mike Pars, being doubled was hard. So the idea of being doubled at half the track by a 312 Giunti was hard. So he looked Giunti that arrived, and 512 was almost the double of 312. So he Parse saw Beltoise. He turned the car, or I don't remember, left or right. Giunti, well, there were yellow flags. I remember the yellow flags because I was racing, but at the time, in the front, he had the back of Beltoise's car, and he went against him. He had no time. So one responsibility, I'm talking about codes, I'm talking about sports. So the responsibility was more to Michael, who had to leave the side of the road before, because there was a good visibility. So maybe he did this to put Giunti in a hard position, so that he could probably get rid of him, because in the quick parts was quick, more than 312, but in a mix, Giunti would have overpassed him. So this was the reality of the time. So we lost a great pilot, a great person, and at those times, apart from the characteristics of the accident, many people, many pilots, each year, the important ones, 2 or 3, lost their lives. Bonnier, Ronnie Peter, they lost their lives during accidents, well, caused by no one, but that was the reality of those times. Thanks again, Andrea, for this witnessing. It's sad, but it is important to narrate how the risk and the dangers were and still are part of car racing. Our first part of the backstage ends here, the part where we narrate, but now there's a second part, just like when we have a live backstage, and you are the protagonist. You can ask questions. Many already arrived, but you can write live some questions, and me, Andrea De Adamic, will be here available to answer to your questions. So just a few seconds and we are back. Usually this is the moment when the protagonist is the public. So with the microphone, I go in the audience, and we wanted to do this even in the virtual version of the backstage. So I asked Raffaella Quacquaro, responsible for press office of the museum, to help me ask the questions to me and Andrea De Adamic, because I'm sure you have many curiosities. Thank you, Lorenzo. Before starting with the first question, I would like to welcome all of our friends who are following us from many countries, from Holland, Portugal, Brazil, Japan, Germany, France. We're welcoming everyone and thanking everyone, hoping that the Backstage event has conveyed the feeling that we would like to feel live here and that we hope will be resumed soon. So the first question is for Andrea, comes from Marco, who's asking how Alfa Romeo was close to get back in Ignazio Giunti for the 1971 season. Andrea, can you hear me? So, while we're waiting for Andrea to get back on the line, there's another question arriving in the chat by Francesco for Lorenzo. So, Francesco is asking whether this car is the car which won in 1971, the Targa Florio. So the one which is here at the museum is a 33 from 1970 with long tail. The long tail was usually prepared for the Le Mans 34-hour, while 33, 3 liters with a short tail, which won the Targa Florio today, is part of an important American collection. But in 2015, when the museum was inaugurated, we had the possibility of having this car here for a few months, and the owner loved to say, please take care of it, because this is not a car which is just a prototype. It could win the Targa Florio even tomorrow. Another question for Lorenzo. Well, actually, it's a comment by Leonardo and is shared by many others. So, this time, as in the previous occasions of Backstage, you have found incredible archive documents. Leonardo says they get me nuts, but where do they come from, these documents? Well, each time we organize a Backstage, there is an archival research which is fundamental, and in the archive there are witnessings, and you can find curious elements that allow us to ask the right questions to people who participate. So technical charts of Auto Delta that we showed are one of the most incredible documents. They are part not of Auto Delta archive, but of the archive of the Sicilian Sport, the secretary, sports secretary of Alfa Romeo, because Carlo Chitti wrote a report and sent it to Alfa Romeo to justify the investment. So if the money put on the motorsport were well used, the slogan of the time was Alfa Romeo vince, Alfa Romeo wins. And in those reports there are not only timings, problems, mechanical sides, but there's many comments often written by Carlo Chitti, who loved to make hard comments on the pilots' behaviors. But for the other match, there are only positive comments, but other pilots were not so well treated with a red pen because they were not very obedient, and Carlo Chitti got angry. Another question in the chat from Marco. How many times has Alfa Romeo won the Targa Florio? Is it the brand who won most? Alfa Romeo won for 10 times. It's not the first. Porsche won for 11 times. But some of these victories left an important sign. First of all, the first victory of Targa Florio by Alfa Romeo is from 1923, when the clover leaf was won and Ugo Sivocci wins the race. It was an incredible race, and luck had an important role. And the 4 clover leaf will become what we know today, so the symbol of all the racing cars and the spirit of Alfa Romeo. But it will not be the only incredible victory. maybe the one that most of all tells of an important era is the 1930 victory obtained by Achille Varzi on an updated version of P2. It was an extreme car, difficult to drive, so the senior pilot Giuseppe Campari refused to drive it, but Achille Varzi was 10 years younger. He wanted to emerge, he accepted to drive it, and originated an incredible race that in the last laps was almost a drama, because Varzi realizes that the tire linked to the tank ruined the tank, so fuel was spilled. It didn't want to stop, and with the flames on his car, he continues to the finish line while his teammate tried to extinguish fire with the seat cover. So there's this image of Varzi arriving with burns and fire in the car, and the mechanics would try to extinguish the fire. Targa Florio also meant this, races meant this, but the 4 clover leaf really helped the pilots, and it was fundamental. So while we wait for Andrea De Adamic to be back, who's with us through Zoom link, another question from Cesare. What was the average race of that race for specifically 126 kilometers per hour over the 72.9 kilometers of the track? It meant an average which was very high. If we think about what Andrea told us, that for most of the track the average speed was very low, not because pilots were prudent, but because the track was really hard. There were donkeys, there were holes, there were little towns, and Alfa Romeo could not express all their power. The 33 liters won the Targa Florio, but it was a car developed to win circuit races. A few weeks before, they won in Varzek, and being on a rough road made it a difficult car to win the race, but they won over Porsche in that year. I have a question from Pablo, which is for Andrea, but I don't know, maybe you can answer. Did you have a spare tire on the car, and was the front tire, but there was a norm that said sports categories had a few characteristics that now are curious. You had to have a spare tire, space for luggage, or at least fake luggage. You had to have a second seat, even though it was not used. So in the norms of the sports category, there was something that linked those cars to the idea of cars derived from the road cars. But there were also tricks not to compromise the performances and respect the norms. The spare tire was a smaller tire, and the luggage department was obtained in the airbox, and the second seat was only put on some tubes, so it was not a real seat. Unfortunately, we have technical problems with the Andrea De Adamic because we have so many questions that arrived for him. But I promise that we will try to get back the connection with him, otherwise we will answer you somehow. So, Marco has a question. So, how was Alfa Romeo close to get back Giunti in 1971? So this was a question for Andrea, but maybe you can tell us what was the climate, the atmosphere of that year for Alfa Romeo. Ignazio Giunti, unfortunately this year there is also the anniversary of his death, the dramatic death that Andrea told us. He was one of the most fashionable pilots of the time. He was also very fun. In Alfa Romeo, he had an incredible fundamental role. He was one of those who brought GTA to its debut. And after that, he was also one of the pilots that Alfa Romeo was keeping an eye on. But what can you find in the archive? Well, sometimes there are letters with pilots, but not very frequently, because almost always there were phone calls by Carlo Chitti, who called the pilots. And for Ignazio Giunti, 1971 was a year as official pilot of Ferrari, but I think that Alfa Romeo, their supporters, never gave up the idea of seeing him racing again for Alfa. Cosimo asks, how many 33 we have in the museum? Do you have in the museum? Well, the museum has a good number of 33. Some of them are 33, some are not real 33s. It means we have a 33 2 liters Daytona from 1968. We have the 33 3 liters that is here with us. We have two 33 TT12 1975 and one of the rare prototypes of 33 SC12 of 1977 with a turbo engine. And we have the second prototype of the 33 for roads. It's one of the cars that draws people to the museum. Many come exactly for that, and it would be impossible for us to open a museum without that car. But also, as I said before, the prototypes that have been realized. So, the Bertone with Carabo, then Iguada by Tal Design, Cuneo by Pininfarina, the 33 Special, always by Pininfarina, and a late realization of that one by Bertone, who in 1976 presents the Navajo. Some followers, after watching our presentation, are asking us when will be possible to come here at the museum again. Can we tell them something? I send a message of hope. Well, what we can say today, so we're telling this as people who have a passion for Alfa Romeo. We are trying to help you visit the museum even at these difficult times. We decided to transform what was one of the events that would gather people, so the backstage, it was the part for the fans, in something that can still be present in your calendar until it will not be possible to gather in person. So we will do it virtually. The hope is that the laws and the situation, that everything will allow us soon to sit in this room with a real audience that has always showed passion, vitality and curiosity when we delved behind these incredible cars. Daniele is asking, will there be an event where we can hear the roars of the engines? Well, one of the parts of the backstage is exactly listening to the protagonists, but also listening to the cars. So, in the past years, we have shown to the public these cars and let them hear the roars of the engine. Here in Sala Giulia we have a small track where these cars can be shown not only standing still but also in motion with their incredible voice. So yes, as soon as there will be the occasion, and it is a promise that I am making, So, for the fans, there will be an occasion to see these cars not at 300 kilometers per hour, but in motion and with their great roar. So we have a question from Theo from Holland, who is a dear friend. So how many cars that drove the Targa Florio are there still in the collection of the museum? Well, how many cars which participated in the Targa Florio are here at the museum? Well, some of the cars that raced are here, but not the winning ones, even though the car that I told you about, the Gran Premio P2 in the 1930 configuration, is exposed in another museum which holds part of the collection of Alfa Romeo in Turin, National Museum of Automobile. There is a car that the Alfa Romeo donated to the museum, and is the car with which Achille Barzi won the Targa Florio in 1930. As I told you before, that 1930 car was an evolution, a transformation, even though it was deep, but the P2, which in 1925 won the first world championship for the Grand Prix cars, and that car was the same part of car that in 1924 won another important event, which was like the founding element of Alfa Romeo races. Well, finally, we have Andrea De Adamic here with us again, so we thank him for being here, and also our followers thank for the incredible narrations that he has. We have many questions. So, let's start again from Giunti. So Marco is asking, Alfa Romeo was close to get back at Giunti for the season of 1971? Another question for Andrea from Barbara. Do you have one car, Alfa, that you drove which is dearest to you? Well, I must say two. First was the Giulia GTA 1600, with which I won 2 European championships. There were no World Championship at the time, beating the Lotus Cortina. I thought it was from Ford. And sometimes, but I won everywhere. Yeah, on all the tracks, also in England, for example, the 500 kilometers. So I won also abroad, but the Lotus Cortina dominated until 1965. Then I arrived. So I have all the magazines showing the results, so I started to win and to beat the Lotus Cortina. Think about the fact that on the Lotus Cortina they would put Ginny Clark and Jackie Stewart, which were linked to Ford, but I beat even them. The only time I didn't beat them was at Castoga, the first race debuting with the GTA 1600 in Sweden. It was 1 hour race, so we went on the pole position and had Ginny Clark with the Lotus Cortina. So there was a right U-turn. I started ahead, I went right, and bang, I was hit in the back tire. So the car stopped, but even Ginny Clark retired from the race. So maybe the goal of Jimmy Clark was that since with the GTA 1600 I was unbeatable, I also was in a pole position. Probably one of his tasks was to eliminate me so that John Gidmore and Taylor, who were the 2 pilots running the European Championship, would have gained points, while for Ginny Clark was not that important. But I beat Ginny Clark and Jackie Stewart, I believe, in the 500 kilometers of Snetterman with a heavy rain. And against Lotus Cortina, after 1 hour and a half. Well, it was 4 hours in total, but after 1 hour and 30, I have motorsport, I have all the magazines, so after 1 hour and 30, I doubled everyone. I doubled everyone on a 5 kilometer track. So GTA 1600, but also me, were very, very fast on the wet, more than on dry terrains. So the second car is a 33 3000, the 8 cylinders, with which in 1971, but the last race valid for a world championship was won by Manuel Fangio in 1951 with a P158, I believe, which was a Formula One. But then Formula One retired on one side and didn't have success in a valid test for a world championship. I won in 1971, again in England. Not in Brunswick, but I don't remember. Yes, Brunswick, where I won together with Pescarolo, beating, because it was wet, the 917 of Sitter and Rodriguez, because on wet they could not be as powerful as on dry terrain. Well, with the 3000 we were able to manage all that handling and power and torque we had. So they were struggling, but I had 917 with pilots like Siffert and Rodriguez. So for us, it was very satisfactory. And then after a few months, I won with Ronnie Peterson the 6 hours valid for the Sport Prototypes World Championship in the United States, beating again the official Porsches of 1917 Porsches with Ciffer and Rodriguez again, which were two pilots always fighting. So 1971 was a particularly favorable year that for Alfa Romeo, there was Lurag as a president at the time, and left incredible satisfaction. I have one last question for Andrea from Orlando, from Portugal. Well, I stopped racing in 1974. I had a dramatic accident driving a Brabham in Formula One when my coach was Bernie Ecclestone. Jody Scheckter with McLaren at the first lap at 280 kilometers per hour stopped in the middle of the track. We were in a group, 280 kilometers per hour, 15 cars had crashes. I was injured, 2 broken legs. I had 4 months of wheelchair, but then I went back in 1974. I won the Italian Championship thanks to the 33 of Alfa Romeo, and my competitor was Arturo Merzario, who was racing with Ferrari, but I had more points in the endurance with Formula One. Well, I had a very bad break in the ankle, so I was not as sensitive with the brakes for Formula One, but for the endurance or prototypes, it was easier to use the gas and the brake. You needed less sensitivity because you were racing with prototypes. So in 74, I realized that my life had to look ahead, and I stopped racing and I started working with one of the sponsors, Philip Morris. Then each car has a story with a pilot, because if you win with the car, but you are living a moment of particular satisfaction, fulfillment, lack of results, well, one victory more doesn't give value to the car rather than a victory which is happen in a disgraceful, unlucky moment when you retired a lot. So one positive result is more important than another result which arrives at another moment, a favorable moment of your career. This is valid for everyone, not only for Andrea De Adamic. No, I drove TZ2. I drove TZ1, but TZ2 was a formidable car. I drove the 33 2 liters, but it was not competitive. I drove the 33 3, 8 cylinders, the TT3, with a different tail, like Porsche 908, which was our competitor in the 3000, and then I drove the TT12. And in 1973, the last valid year for Targa Florio as World Championship of the prototype, at 2 laps, there were 11 laps, at 2 laps from the ending, I was with Tomele, we were heading with 8 minutes, and after when only 2 laps were missing at the end, so it was 73 kilometers track, while I was overpassing a car, I was hit by that car. We were 600 kilos, and with the Spider, HS Spider was 870, so heavier, so we had to retire because we went off-road. So I arrived second in 1971, third at the Targa Florio in 1972, fifth and ninth when I debuted in 1964 with a Ferrari 250 Le Mans. I was 22. And I just drove, I think, the GTA, which was 1,600, 160 horsepower. A Ferrari had more than 400. But this is another story. So before concluding this first edition of the Backstage in the virtual mode, I have one last question for Lorenzo from Uneri. So in your archival documents, you can understand the role of the technical support of Autodelta compared to 33.3, which was not part of the official team. So there was a support for the team or not? So what emerges from the documents? Well, from the technical report linked to the Targa Florio, the 33 of Todaro is listed, but just as a private car. So officially, there was no support. Of course, it was a car which had been sold a little before by a small racing department, which was part of the Alfa Romeo group, but which was a family environment. So I would not exclude that there was a support or a consultancy, but in the reports which were proposed to the managers of Alfa with the technical direction that Luraghi, Dinola and Bardini read, it was just listed, but in those technical relations there was an appendix listing all the Alfa Romeo cars that participated in the races, because it was fundamental for Alfa Romeo and Autodelta having an exact description of what Alfa Romeo as brand was able to obtain from that experience, both for the official, with the official team, which justified the investments, but also in general from the other cars. Well, we can conclude. The followers are sending really comments from Peru, Argentina, every part of the world. So February the 28th, we have another Backstage. Yes, I want to thank the audience that stayed with us despite everything. I would like to thank Andrea de Adamic, who wanted to stay with us and answer to our and your questions. And it is a great witness. I thank Hezemans, who gave his version of the facts, but I would like to thank as well all of the colleagues that allowed us, despite all the difficulties of these moments, to organize this Backstage, working behind the scenes, but always with great passion and skill. So Raffaella, Alonso Antonio Renda, Marco Torreggiani, Roberto Cavaliere, and Gemma Perrone. Thank you, everyone, and see you next time, next month, and we hope soon to gather here in person. Thank you, have a nice evening.